We're diving into a single, really explosive book today. It's a piece of profound theological inquiry called Unauthorized Grace.
Mm.
And this source material is intense. I mean, it takes queer theory and puts it into this direct, almost volatile dialogue with classical Christology and with, centuries of institutional religious doctrine.
Right.
So our mission today, just to be clear for you, is not to adjudicate this or endorse it. It's really to understand the force of the argument. We're going to unpack the core thesis that's challenging these established moral doctrines, specifically the ones that define human sexuality, binary gender, and the very mechanics of divine grace. We're going deep into why these authors are contending that official church pronouncements are, actually getting the divine order exactly backward.
And that central provocative thesis you mentioned is that queer love and desire themselves. They represent this unauthorized grace.
Unauthorized grace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is the presence of the divine that, according to the source, exists and flourishes entirely outside of, and often in spite of, ecclesiastical approval or, Vatican protocol.
Wow.
It suggests that God's blessing is always already active in the world, and it's inherently unattached to the formal structures that were designed to administer it.
That immediately flips the institutional script, doesn't it? I mean, the church usually holds the key to the gate. If grace is unauthorized, where does it even start? Okay, let's unpack the core idea they use to justify this. They call it existential sacramentality. It sounds like they're refocusing Christianity not on a set of rules, but on a physical reality.
Precisely. They argue the Christian message doesn't begin with a decree or, a law written on a scroll. It begins with the incarnation. God entering fully into human physicality, into lived, messy life. And that right there is the radical reframing of grace.
Okay, so a sacrament isn't just a ritual in a church.
No, and the source draws a crucial distinction here that we really need to define for you. They separate public ecclesial sacramentality, which is the liturgical rite celebrated in church, the formal blessing, all the visible structures,
The official stuff.
from existential sacramental reality.
Yeah.
And that is the immediate, unmediated experience of grace in the actual lived quality of a relationship.
So the immediate lived experience is the primary holy event. And the source takes this idea to, an absolutely breathtaking conclusion when it comes to intimacy.
It does. The central claim is audacious.
Yeah.
It's that physical love, desire, and sexual union, when they're marked by respect, by justice, and responsibility, they're the first sacrament.
The first event.
The first sacrament, and an immediate revelation of lived grace. This idea is used to completely destabilize the institutional claim to holiness. The authors even use this really striking metaphor to emphasize the point. They suggest the act of love, culminating in shared passion, is a true sign of the sacred.
A true sign of the sacred.
And the orgasm itself is metaphorically referred to as the most original sacrament.
Wow. Let's just pause there for a moment. That is an immense inversion of the traditional structure. I get the theological argument they're making, but isn't it a bit naive to suggest the institutional church's role is merely a subsequent witness?
Right.
Institutions exist to establish boundaries, to enforce a shared meaning. If you remove that structure completely, how do you prevent subjective chaos, even with the caveats about respect and responsibility?
And that's the critical pushback, and the source actually addresses it head on. They acknowledge the institutional need for order, of course.
Yeah.
But they insist that the institution has confused its role with its source of power.
Okay.
The church's power, they argue, isn't to create grace, but only to recognize it.
So it's a witness, not a gatekeeper.
Exactly. The church's role, like an official marriage or blessing, is reduced to a subsequent witness to the gifts experienced. It's just confirming what God has already constituted in the love between two people.
So grace is based on the quality of the relationship.
Yes. Its depth, its fidelity, trust, its capacity to uplift, not by institutional approval or some legal status. The source states pretty bluntly that the priest and the entire construct of priestly ministry can only welcome and express in words what is already truly present.
So God is the initiator.
God is the true initiator of grace, not the church acting as a middleman who can authorize or deny it.
That clarity helps a lot. It really sounds like the source material is completely dismantling the institutional claim to mediate grace. If that's the case, we have to look at the traditional arguments they're taking apart. Specifically, the order of creation. This is the rigid framework the magisterium uses to justify all the prohibitions.
Right. And we should probably define magisterium here for you. That's simply the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. And yes, the theological critique offered by the source is that this dogmatic binary thinking, this insistence on only male and female, is a theological category error.
A category error, what do they mean by that?
The error happens because the Church treats these poetic biblical narratives as if they were biological normative code. These are poetic stories meant to convey symbolic or relational truths, like the fullness of creation.
But they're being used like a biology textbook.
Exactly. They're being used by the institution as a natural checklist for human function and identity. And the consequence of this error, they argue, is profound and, well, deeply harmful.
Okay, let's break down that biblical rereading. Where do they start to undermine that strict Genesis binary?
They go right to Genesis 1.27. When it speaks of creating humans male and female, the critique argues this is a poetic confession of completeness, of fullness. It's not a biological census.
So it's not literally counting two types of people? Not at all. The source points out that the original Hebrew term for the primordial being is Adam, which just means human or earthling. And it's initially described as this undifferentiated asexual being. Gender comes later, dynamically. But the fundamental divine image is imprinted on Adam regardless of any binary distinction. So using that text to mandate exactly two rigid genders is, to them, a fundamental misreading of its intent.
And crucially, they note this misreading gets even worse when you hold it up against, well, modern scientific reality. The idea that biology dictates a strict two-gender framework is itself scientifically narrow.
Exactly. The source brings in modern biology to show that nature itself is not a rigid dichotomy. The argument that gender just reduces neatly to simple XXXY chromosomes is insufficient. Science recognizes a whole spectrum of chromosomal constellations, XXY in Klinefelter syndrome, X4 Turner syndrome.
Intersexuality, DSDs.
All of it. A host of variations in sexual development. Yeah. The argument is that the complexity of creation is the actual order, not some simplified binary model we've imposed on it.
So when the Church fixes on this rigid two-gender order, it commits what the source calls idolatry. Idolatry of its own concept of nature.
Yes, it elevates a human-defined, simplified biological norm above the complexity of God's own creative genius.
And in doing that, the institution turns the gospel, which is supposed to be good news of freedom and inclusion,
to a threatening message that actively violates the love and dignity of people who just don't fit into that narrow framework. The logic is that the standard has to shift from a static, idealized order toward the dynamic, ever-unfolding diversity of creation.
Okay, this is where it gets particularly challenging for traditionalists, right? Because the queer theological movement finds liberation within the most traditional and often, let's be honest, weaponized texts. So why is Paul, who is so often cited against queer life, reread as an ally by this movement?
This is one of the most intellectually fascinating parts of the source material. Queer theology focuses on the immense liberating potential of Paul's central theology, the victory of charis grace over nomos law.
Grace over law.
Right. For Paul, life in Christ is about freedom, not about regulation. The argument is that Paul's call to freedom, Galatians 5.1, do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of heteronomy, is interpreted as this comprehensive critique of all rigid identity constraints.
Including gender and sexual norms.
Including them, yes. Heteronomy just means being ruled by external laws. And the authors read Paul as saying that the gospel frees you from needing those external social categories to define your worth before God.
And the ultimate cornerstone here has to be Galatians 3.28. It's quoted all the time, but how does queer theology maximize the reading of there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female?
They read this as the Magna Carta of inclusion. The argument is that in Christ, all the divisions that determine status, ethnic, social, and gender are abolished as ultimate criteria for dignity.
So if Jew, Greek, and slave-free are neutralized,
then the category of male-female must also be neutralized as an ultimate defining criterion. It doesn't mean those differences just disappear, but that those differences no longer rule over us or determine our access to grace.
This focus on radical inclusion, it connects directly to Christology itself, right? The study of the nature of Christ. Jesus is seen as the ultimate boundary crosser whose own affinities queer the rigid norms of masculinity and purity.
Yes. The incarnation itself, God binding himself to a vulnerable, dependent human body, is explicitly understood as a radical thwarting of idealized masculine norms and purity codes. I mean, Jesus constantly prioritizes connection over convention, touching the unclean, eating with sinners, and his deeply intimate, affective relationships, like the closeness with the beloved disciple. He's seen not as a judge of difference, but as the embodiment of God's preference for elective affinity over any biological or legal mandate.
Now we have to turn to the institutional landscape, where the enforcement of these strict binary norms clashes, well, violently with the internal reality. This leads to what the source calls profound hypocrisy. Let's talk about that phrase, preach water, drink wine.
This internal contradiction leads directly to the Church's loss of moral credibility. The source points out the institutional sanctimoniousness. Rules are strictly enforced externally, while exceptions and contradictions are rampant internally. And the most striking internal contradiction they note is the cultural phenomenon of the Catholic Church, being described as the highest form of camp.
A highest form of camp.
They mean that the institution's elaborate, ritualized aesthetic, the men in lace vestments and silk cassocks, the intense emotional and visual drama of the liturgy. It historically attracts many gay men, even as the official doctrine condemns queer existence. The irony, the source notes, is thick. The whole spectacle is described as having a touch of drag show on the pulpit.
Wow.
It creates this massive dissonance between performance and pronouncement.
That level of self-betrayal has to fundamentally undermine the Church's authority in the modern world. So what are the consequences of this hypocrisy on the Church's ability to define salvation and grace?
Well, the source material argues that the Church's exclusive interpretive authority over salvation is eroding. It's not just because of the contradiction we just discussed, but it's heavily compounded by crises like the abuse scandals. So authority is becoming polycentric. It's no longer centralized in the Vatican alone.
Polycentric, meaning many centers of power and truth, not just one.
Exactly. Believers are relying less on distant Vatican decrees and more on other sources of truth that are closer to their lived experience. These new centers of authority include the sensus fidelium, which is the sense of faith among the people, the collective belief.
Which often finds these teachings just unmerciful or antiquated.
Right. And authority is also forming, maybe surprisingly, in digital spaces. The source highlights the provocative notion that the internet is the new council. Believers negotiate, discuss, and agree on interpretations of love and grace in online forums and communities, often in direct opposition to the official position.
Right.
The ultimate realization is that God's grace cannot be monopolized by the Church. It has been fundamentally democratized.
This whole deep dive just reveals a profound tension, doesn't it? A necessary bottom-up shift from the static order of creation that seeks to fix and control identities to the dynamic diversity of creation that frees and blesses. And we are seeing this shift play out in real time.
Absolutely. The source notes that the Church is already changing from the bottom up. You have many contemporary practices, like the public #LaterBeWent blessing services in Germany, which means love wins, demonstrating a creative protest.
Right.
These actions are pastorally coherent. They meet the spiritual needs of the people, even if they are canonically unauthorized. They are living examples of unauthorized grace being enacted publicly.
Which leaves the institution facing a profound challenge. If these prohibitions are maintained primarily through tradition or fear or power interests rather than the actual gospel message, then the source argues those prohibitions are just exposed as politics, not gospel.
And that leads to the crucial question the source leaves us with. By insisting on an exclusion that is theologically absurd-like, refusing to bless a love that is already recognized as an existential sacrament and a place of healing, does the hierarchy risk not only losing credibility, but succumbing to corrupt obedience?
Corrupt obedience.
It's a point where strict adherence to rules designed to protect the institution is prioritized over the actual salvation and dignity of real people. The Church has to decide if it will preserve its rigid external norms or embrace the full, diverse, unauthorized reality of divine love that flourishes outside its control.
It seems the ultimate lesson from unauthorized grace is that if the quality of love is the true sign of the sacred, then the institutional definition of grace will always be secondary. The divine reality, according to this source, has already moved beyond the borders the Church drew around it.